Some people are born great, some have greatness thirst upon them, and some achieve greatness. To the last category, Bharat Ratna, Baba Saheb Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar belongs. Ambedkar is one of those figures in the history of India about whom many people know a little, a very few understanding anything much. Most educated Indians could tell you that he was the leader of so-called low-caste and outcast communities called Dalits, formerly known by audacious and now unconstitutional term untouchables. Ambedkar was a great nationalist, political thinker, reformer, and revolutionary and prolific writer with prodigious ideas. He stood for all scientific and social activities which enhance the cause of human progress and happiness. His contribution in the making of the Constitution of India was phenomenal. He unimpeachably fought for the betterment of the oppressed classes, and in this struggle he showed a crusading spirit, carving out in the process an eminent position for himself among the prominent architects of modern India. Ambedkar had played a most important role in the forming of India's constitution. No one took greater trouble and care over constitution making than Dr. Ambedkar. He carved a unique and unpregnable pride of place and honor in the history of free Indian nation.
I shall not enter into the merits of the constitution because I feel, however good a constitution may be, it is sure to turn out bad because those who are called to work it happen to be a bad lot. However bad a constitution may be, it may turn out to be good if those who are called to work upon it happen to be a good lot. It is therefore futile to pass any judgment upon the constitution without reference to the part which the people and their parties are likely to play.
Those who follow him as Dalits, Neo-Buddhists, as political activists, the faith, if you will, in whatever be the reason for their dearness to his persona or his ideas, refer to Ambedkar as Baba Saheb and address use with as much respect and affection as Mahatma or Bapu for Mohandas Gandhi. Not everyone knows much about Ambedkar, but many who do know him or of him believe in him passionately and speak of him with a kind of fervor normally reserved for religious figures, prophets, saints, those who uttered revelations and those who brought deliverance. His breadth of his interest and the depth of his knowledge was truly astounding. Ambedkar's life was punctuated by a series of setbacks and disappointments, he to which propelled himself towards loftier goals, more difficult challenges and stronger assertions of the will to overcome inimical circumstances and hostile world.
You are worse than buffaloes, donkeys and dogs!
Ambedkar was born on 14th April 1891 in the town of military cantonment of Maho, which is now in Madhya Pradesh. He was the 14th and last child of Ramji Maloji Sakpal, an army officer who held the rank of Subedar, and Bhimabai Sakpal, his mother. Ambedkar was born into a poor low-mahar caste who were treated as untouchables and subjected to socio-economical discrimination. The young Ambedkar, whose family had moved to Bombay in 1897, was scaling unknown heights. Unknown only because centuries-old barbarity had turned him into an unwitting pioneer of sorts. He became the first untouchable to enroll in Elphinstone High School, the first untouchable to graduate from Bombay University, the first untouchable to receive a scholarship to study at Columbia University, first untouchable used without knowing what evil lay within it, an epithet laced with unfathomable shame.
Listen, what's a boring untouchable going to teach us?
Wait till my father hears about this.
Think what this buffoon is going to speak in English.
I'm Professor Ambedkar. I'll be your lecturer in political economy. In case you are wondering what could I possibly teach you, allow me to introduce myself. I have an MA and PhD in public finance from the Columbia University in New York. My thesis covered the financial history of India from 1765 to the present. In addition, I am working towards an MSc from the London School of Economics. If any of you feel that I am not qualified to teach you and would like to leave, feel happy to do so now.
He was gifted with extraordinary intellectual powers and ambitious father, encouraging teachers and royal benefactor, all of which together ensured that he went to college in Bombay and won the scholarship to Columbia University. But despite his talents, advantages and lucky breaks, and despite his innate drive, Ambedkar's childhood and early youth were marred by visceral experiences of prejudice, bigotry and violence of an untouchable existence. He could not sit next to his upper caste classmates. He was denied food and water for long days at school because his every touch considered polluting. He was not permitted to study Sanskrit at university because of his ritually debased caste status. Instead, he majored in English and Persian, which was just as well, and his everyday life was riddled with the insults, segregation and physical abuse that was routine for members of his caste. Nevertheless, at the recommendation, interestingly, of the couple of Brahmin professors, the scion of the nearby princely states of Baroda, the Gaikwad Maharaja decided to fund his higher studies.
I have a contribution for your London studies.
Ambedkar, as an untouchable, was subjected to certain indignities and discriminations. In the school, he could not sit in the midst of his classmates according to his rank, but that he had to sit in a corner by himself, had to carry a separate piece of gunny cloth to squat on in the classroom, and the servant employed to clean the school would not touch the gunny used by him. He had to carry the gunny cloth in the evening and bring it back in the next day. While in the school, the children of the touchable classes, when they felt thirsty, could go out to the water tap, open it and quench their thirst. All that was necessary was the permission of the teacher. But his position was separate. He could not touch the tap unless it was opened for him by a touchable person. It was not possible for him to quench his thirst. In his case, the permission of the teacher was not enough. The presence of the school peon was necessary, for he was the only person whom the class teacher could use for such a purpose. If the peon was not available, he had to go out without water. The situation can be summed up in the statement, "No peon, no water." It is a miracle that Ambedkar chose to stay in the Creole land. Many of those who now profess their unbound love for India would not hesitate to leave at the first instance of injustice, or for a better career opportunity and a better standard of living. But he stayed, even though he was denied love, denied a touch, a simple human touch. Ambedkar packed his bags to leave America to study under the guidance of John Dewey. At Columbia, the year was 1913. He was supported by scholarships from the rulers of two princely states, Baroda and Kolhapur. In America, Ambedkar was in the company of some of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, like John Dewey, James Shortwell, Edwin Seligman and James Harvey Robinson. In the late summer of 1913, the young man found himself in the Morningside Heights on West Streets, between Broadway in Amsterdam, very far indeed from India, and its cruel and senseless humiliation.
The teacher said, "No Brahmin worth his salt will defile the language of Vedas."
Didn't I tell you to go straight to the principal?
I did. You said things will be different in Bombay.
Goats are used as sacrificial offerings, not lions. Stop crying.
With the perseverance and grits so characteristic of his temperament, Ambedkar raced through an MA and PhD in anthropology, political economy, writing master's and doctoral theses that would in every short order be published as his first scholarly article and book respectively. The next 5 years would prove to be the most tumultuous yet in the history of mankind. Ambedkar was in America. He was liberated from the shackles put on him by his motherland of caste prejudice and untouchability. Ambedkar wrote, "My 5 years of staying in Europe and America had completely wiped out of my mind any consciousness that I was an untouchable." His joyous years, joyous only because for the first time in his life, he had experienced what being treated as a human felt like at Columbia and then at London behind him. In 1917, Ambedkar was abruptly summoned back to India. It seems as the Gaikwada had all along intended a scholarship as a loan to be repaid through service in the Maharaja's employs. Ambedkar was understandably unhappy to have his studies rudely interrupted and his bursary recast as a debt. He booked his luggage on a separate ship than the one he was on from London back to Bombay. As it happened, that other vessel peed out by German submarine, taking with it his entire pains, taking Bill's library, all his notes, papers and writings, and even his doctoral thesis at Columbia. That then he had to rewrite to the final award of the degree. So this is why we do not know much about his years in New York, except from whatever little he may have said about later on in his life.
We heard a bomb hit your ship.
A bomb?
But thank God, it was not your ship. We went to the ship's office. They told us your telegram was wrong. Only your luggage was on that ship.
A bomb hit the ship with my luggage?
Yes, we thought your ship had sunk.
My books were on that ship.
Forget about your books. What are you talking? At least you are alive.
He was rudely reminded of his dependent family back at home. His father had died and he had a young wife and child. Ambedkar had been married off, as was customary in those days, at the young age of 19 to a girl of 9. 11 years prior to his return home, things only gone worse though when he arrived in Gujarat to serve as a Maharaja's military secretary. He got no water to drink, nor tea, no lunch with his colleagues, nor dinner with his landlords. He only admitted him to his boarding house under a false identity as a Parsi gentleman. He could not even get a lamp at night to be able to read in his room after the workday.
I want a room.
Your name, please?
Bhimrao Ambedkar.
Hindu, huh? Caste?
Mahar.
Sorry, I don't have a room.
At least for a week.
You want to close my hotel? Try somewhere else.
Roshan?
Yes?
Passenger? Are you alone?
Yes.
Is this your only luggage?
Yes.
Come. Roshan! He is not Parsi. He is not wearing Sudre Kusti. Who are you? You are not a Parsi.
Yes, I am.
Trying to fool us?
All right. Show me your Sudre Kusti. Come on, show us.
I'm Hindu.
You can't stay here. This dharamsala is maintained by the community for the use of Parsis only.
I see your difficulty. I can assume a Parsi name for the register. You will also gain something if I stay here. I leave as soon as I am sanctioned a house. I'm an officer in the accounts department of Baroda State.
All right. You'll have to pay 5 annas for the day, for boarding and lodging. And you'll have to register under a Parsi name.
For all his qualifications as the most educated individual in the whole Principality of Baroda, he was right backward. He had started an untouchable. The story is that one day he was discovered and thrown out of his hostel and spent at night at Municipal Park under a tree burning with humiliation. Angry and frustrated, Ambedkar quit his job and went back to Bombay to rejoin his family. Fortunately, he was appointed a professor of political economy at Sydenham College, and in 3 or 4 years he had saved enough money and go back to London to resume his studies between 1920 and 1923. He earned a second MA and a second PhD at the LSE, as well as a law degree from Grayson in London. He even spent a few months at the University of Bonn, Germany, working towards PhD in Indology, the very same subject that he had been disallowed from studying as an undergraduate 15 years earlier, because Sanskrit was supposedly off limits to Persians of low caste. This overcompensation reveals the extent to which he took shoddy treatment in India to heart, and also suggested desperate desires not to have go home and deal with the reality of discrimination. That was not going anywhere, no matter how high above his birth, he climbed through and shredded into hard work. He returned to India. He wrote, "On my arrival, I straightway went to Baroda. My 5 years of staying in Europe and America had completely wiped out of my mind any consciousness that I was an untouchable, and that an untouchable, whenever he went in India, was a problem to himself and to others." Ambedkar wrote, "I had friends in Baroda who had come to America for study. Would they welcome me if I went? I could not assure myself. They may feel embarrassed at admitting an untouchable into their household. I stood under the roof of the station for some time, thinking where to go and what to do. Of all the blights this world has to offer, the wildest is the rejection of mind and of spirit, and no one who has not experienced it can even begin to imagine the horror of it." Ambedkar wrote, "It's difficult for them to understand how it is possible for a few untouchables to live on the edge of a village, daily to free it from the most disagreeable of its filth, and to carry the errands of all and sundry. Collect food at the doors of the Hindus, buy spices and oil at the shops of the Hindu Baniya from a distance, regard the village in every way as their home, and yet never touched or to be touched by anyone belonging to the village." When Ambedkar was 9 years old, he travelled to Koregaon. His recounting of the journey can make you lose faith in humanity. It takes us to a place where the souls have turned to stone. Ambedkar wrote, "We told the station master that we were bound for Koregaon, and that we were waiting for father or his servant to come, but that neither had turned up, and that we know how to reach Koregaon. We were well-dressed children. From our dress or talk, no one could make out that we are children of the untouchables." Children of the untouchables, how smoothly ran the ink that wrote these words, without irony or outrage, without quotes, without the crutches of human kindness. Ambedkar never received, so he could pause and reflect, deconstruct this cruel cataloguing. Ambedkar continues, "There were many bullock carts plying for hire. Not one of them was prepared to suffer being polluted and to demean himself carrying passengers of the untouchable classes. We are prepared to pay double the fare, but we found that money did not work."
You never told me you are Mahas! You liars! You can't travel in my car! You were so well-dressed that I thought you...
We will pay double the fare.
Double? Triple? Who cares? Give me myself, pollute myself for money?
We are thirsty. We want some water.
There was plenty of food with us. There was hunger burning within us. With all this, we were to sleep without food. That was because we could get no water. And we could get no water because we were untouchables. No one touched him. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, untouched. Ambedkar described this incident as one that had left an indelible impression on his mind, despite the fact that it was not first time that his caste identity had been impressed upon him. His father was surprised to see them that he had received no intimation of their coming. It was discovered that the fault of his father's servant that he failed to intimate his father. It was as though he was determined to deploy the surfeit of his own qualifications and capabilities by the centuries of oppression of his most wretched brethren. Ambedkar launched a series of agitations, mobilizations and campaigns to demand that untouchables be allowed to access public goods like drinking water from tanks and wells, that they be allowed to move freely and in dignified manner and without threat to life or limb in public places, roads and parks, and they be granted to sacred temples to exercise right to worship therein like other Hindus. Predictably, caste Hindus, even liberal, educated and anglicized urban people, were intransigent.
Why do you worsen and sadden the picture of the sorrows, poverty, slavery and burdens of the world? With your deplorable, despicable and detestable, miserable life, you had better die and relive this world if you cannot rise to a new life, or you cannot rejuvenate yourselves. Wake up.
Ambedkar would take one step forward and have to backtrack 2 steps. Temples were claimed to be private property. Tanks were ritually purified after untouchables had taken water from them. In December 1927, Ambedkar publicly burned a copy of the ancient Hindu scripture, the Law Code of Manu. which enshrines the arcane punishments and prohibitions against low caste and untouchables in the holy language of Sanskrit.
क्षुद्रतु कार्ये दास्यं कृतभकृतमेव वा दास्याय वै सृष्टोऽसौ ब्राह्मण्यात् स्वयंभुव वैश्य शूद्रो प्रयत्नेन स्वानि कर्माणि कारयेत् सौहि जितो स्वकर्मभ्य क्षोभयेतामिदं जगत् न स्वामिना निसृष्टोऽपि शूद्रा दास्याद् विमुच्यते निसर्गजं हिततस्य कस्तस्मात् दपोहति.
Matters came to a head when Ramsay MacDonald's communal award, creating separate electorates for Muslims on one hand and untouchables on the other. Ambedkar was in favor, Gandhi was opposed. Ambedkar saw untouchables as a type of minority like Muslims and now threatened to further break Hindus into upper caste and so-called depressed classes or lower caste and untouchables. Gandhi raised the stakes by going on a fast unto death. If his views were not respected, he pledged to educate Harang and same-caste Hindus until they ceased and resisted practices. Opinion and political pressure were unequivocal in Gandhi's favor. Ambedkar had to back down and entered into the so-called Pune Pact in September 1932 to keep untouchables together with the other Hindus within joint electorates. This agreement broke Gandhi's fast, but it also broke Ambedkar's faith in Gandhi, in the Congress and in caste Hindus. Mahatma Gandhi was frightened for Ambedkar's intellect. Ultimately, greatness is judged not by how right you were, but rather how wrong. Gandhi got it wrong more times than Ambedkar got it right.
Shall I tell you something? Don't use the weapon of fast too often. Your life is so precious and the country needs you.
Who else but Ambedkar to have assisted Gandhi like no one ever dared to, before or after him? Dr. Ambedkar was adept in understanding the mindset of political Islam, and he rightly evaluated the Malabar Rebellion, popularly known as Mopla Rebellion, as an outbreak to establish the kingdom of Islam in Malabar by overthrowing the British government and non-believer Hindus. But Marxist historians painted these upheavals as insurgents against landlords and colonial rulers, in tune with their class war theory. Thus, Dr. Ambedkar's warnings were neglected and undivided India suffered. In the long history of communal conflicts between Hindus and Muslims in India, Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar marked the span of 20 years from 1920 to 1940 as a record of 20 years of civil war between the Hindus and Muslims by the fanatic Muslims. During the civil war, that Dr. Ambedkar mentioned the act of most heinous monstrosity performed on the Hindus of Malabar by the Muslim Moplas during the notorious Mopla Rebellion in 1921. The general nature of these uprisings was reflected in the observation made by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar on the status of communal conflicts perpetrated all over India by Muslims against Hindus. Dr. Ambedkar observed there was carnage, pillage, sacrilege and outrage of every species perpetrated by Hindus against Muslims and by Muslims against Hindus, in which whole families of Hindus, men, women and children were roasted alive and consumed in the fire to the great satisfaction of the Musliman spectators. Dr. Ambedkar was baffled by the attitude and treatment accorded to the Hindus in Malabar, irrespective of their social status, by the Mopla rebels during the course of their action against the British authority. Massacres, forcible conversions, desecration of temples, foul outrages upon women such as ripping open pregnant women, etc. were the barbaric atrocities committed by the Muslim rioters. Gandhi persuaded the Congress to support the Khilafat movement, a violent agitation for restoration of the Islamic Caliphate, disposed by the victorious British before long. Ambedkar, who saw Gandhi advocacy of the Khilafat movement as a pernicious political stunt, he said the movement was started by the Muslims. It was taken up by Mr. Gandhi with a tenacity and faith which must have surprised many Muslims themselves. Ambedkar viewed the Mopla rebellion as nothing but jihad. Indeed, Muslim leaders themselves agreed with Ambedkar that it was jihad, but Gandhi did not. Maulana Hasrat Mohani, the eulogized freedom fighter and a friend of the Mahatma, and one incidentally who had coined the slogan Inquilab Zindabad, justified the massacre of Hindus by saying that this was Islamic jihad and that according to the rules of jihad, those who help the enemy become enemies themselves. Shockingly, Gandhi was conciliatory towards the Maulana. He says, "I don't blame the Maulana. He looks upon the British government as an enemy. He would defend anything done in fighting it." Ambedkar was incensed at Gandhi's selectivity, more so of his stand on the Mopla massacre. He said in a quote, "Mr. Gandhi has never called the Muslims to account, even when they have been guilty of gross crimes against the Hindus," said Ambedkar. Mr. Gandhi has never protested against such murders of prominent Hindus like Swami Shraddhananda Rajpal, Nathuramal Sharma. Not only have the Muslims not condemned these outrages, but even Mr. Gandhi has never called upon the leading Muslims to condemn them. He has kept silent over them. Such an attitude can be explained only on the ground that Mr. Gandhi was anxious to preserve Hindu-Muslim unity and did not mind the murders of a few Hindus if it could be achieved by sacrificing their lives. Ambedkar next turned to Gandhi's behavior during the Mopla massacre, a pogrom he had condemned in the strongest of terms earlier. Mr. Gandhi was so much obsessed by the necessity of establishing Hindu-Muslim unity that he was prepared to make light of the doings of the Moplas and the Khilafats who were congratulating them. He spoke of the Moplas as a brave God-fearing Moplas who were fighting for what they considered as religion and in a manner which they considered as religious. Another incident around the same time brought to light the differences between Ambedkar and Gandhi, underscoring further the gap that exists between objectivity and sensitivity, and how the latter is used to devastating effect in politics. It was a publication of a pamphlet called Rangela, written as a retaliation for Sita Ka Chinala, a book penned by a Muslim, Mahashay Rajpal. Ambedkar stood for Mahashay Rajpal, the publisher of the pamphlet who was assassinated by a Muslim fanatic Ilmuddin. This while Muhammad Ali Jinnah defended Ilmuddin in court, and none other than Allama Iqbal carried Ilmuddin's coffin at the funeral. Ambedkar was outraged at what was done to Rajpal. Gandhi was outraged at what Rajpal did. "I am no defender of the author of Rangila Rasool," said Gandhi, adding that the book gave him deep pain. He called the book offensive and its author a mischief maker. He wanted the law changed. In came a dreaded IPC section 295A, calling for punishing those who hurt religious sensibilities, and the India of the kind Ambedkar and imagined, an India proclaiming liberty and freedom of expression, changed forever for the worse. The dismantling of Gandhi's sainthood by Ambedkar took a decisive turn in the late 1920s. It is revealing that of the 98 weighty volumes that make up the collective works of Mahatma Gandhi, Ambedkar's name does not figure till the 53rd volume from then on. There is a veritable Cambrian explosion, and Ambedkar features regularly and copiously. The build-up to the Pune Pact, the Temple Entry Bill, the state of the so-called depressed classes, and tellingly, Gandhi anxiety that Ambedkar and he was not the true representative of Dalits.
The long-standing confrontation between Mr. Gandhi and Dr. Ambedkar has finally dissolved in the form of the Pune Pact. Dr. Ambedkar has agreed to sign it without the condition of a referendum. He and Pandit Malviya will sign it. This will bring to an end Mr. Gandhi's long fast.
Gandhi could not stomach the rise of Ambedkar. Time and time again, he tries to show Ambedkar his place is patronizing to the extreme, displays uncharacteristic rudeness, and gets into banal contests as to who truly represented Dalits. Here is Gandhi blistering with unease and envy, said, "I repudiate Ambedkar's claim to represent the depressed classes. I am the representative of the depressed classes, get a mandate, and I may not be elected, but Ambedkar cannot be returned." What Gandhi blurted out was true. He not only would have been elected, he would have been elected with a thumping majority, and on any seat he wished to contest. Ambedkar, on the other hand, would have forfeited his deposit. He lost 2 elections that he later contested. Fame and foresight are rarely bedfellows. The Mahatma was relentless. It was almost as though he was canvassing door to door. He said, I'm speaking with a due sense of responsibility, and I say that It is not a proper claim which is registered by Dr. Ambedkar when he seeks to speak for the whole of the untouchables of India. When a delegation of Dalits asked him, "To what extent can we consider you as our own man?" Gandhi replied, "Since before displaying cring-worthy condescension we confronted to the subject of temple entry by a cool and collected Ambedkar." Says Gandhi, "You are born an untouchable, but I am an untouchable by adaptation. As a new convert, I feel more for the welfare of the community than those who are already there." Ambedkar was beginning to get used to such patronizing fluff. He said, "I have no interest in the temple being thrown open to us."
You are an untouchable by birth. I consider myself untouchable by adoption.
Things came to head on the subject of untouchability, caste and Varna. Ambedkar's views were well known. He had earned them through decades of studying Hinduism. His thoughts were not meant to win political battles, but rather philosophical, even existential ones. Gandhi was an ardent, almost militant supporter of the caste system, not just early on in his life, when one could be forgiven for subscribing to uninformed opinions, but well into his mature political and spiritual avatar. "The caste system is a natural order of society. I am opposed to all those who are out to destroy the caste system," said the father of our nation. Gandhi watered down his love for the caste system a little without abandoning it and bestowed his tenderness instead on the Varna system, except that now his views became even more bizarre and bigoted. "I believe that the divisions into Varna is based on birth," he asserted. "There is nothing in the Varna system which stands in the way of the Shudra acquiring learning or studying military art of offense or defense. The Varna system is no bar to him. What the Varna system enjoins is that a Shudra will not make learning a way of earning a living. He can learn, but he must not earn from it."
Manu says, the only occupation the Lord prescribed to the low castes is to meekly serve the other three castes. No collection of wealth must be made by the low castes, even though they are able to do so.
There is no harm if a person belonging to one Varna acquires the knowledge or science and art specialized in by persons belonging to other Varnas. But as far as the way of earning his living is concerned, he must follow the occupation of the Varna to which he belongs, which means he must follow the hereditary profession of his forefathers. Gandhi says, "I believe in the Varna system because it fixes the duties and occupations of persons." Varna means the determination of man's occupation before he is born. In the Varna system, no man has any liberty to choose his occupation. His occupation is determined for him by hereditary. These then were the views of the self-anointed redeemer of Dalits, that a Shudra can gain and dispense knowledge, fight in a war, do business, but he must earn his living through serving others. Reading, fighting and doing business were to be his hobbies, nothing more. Gandhi had become the supreme test for Ahimsa himself. There was no way out. The Mahatma just would not admit he could be wrong, that he was building a house of cards while tormented by a sneezing fit. Sadly, his crude, unscholarly crunchings only increased in their ferocity and obstinacy with time, even as he could see he was on thin ice. Hereditary Varnashrama Dharma was Hinduism's greatest gift to mankind, he said. While what Ambedkar desires, he complained, is complete destruction of Varnashrama Dharma, of his imagination. Varnashrama to him means the essence of superiority and inferiority. Varnashrama will be purged of the very thing for which Dr. Ambedkar abhors it. This was total nonsense and Ambedkar told him as much. "I shall have nothing to do with Varnashrama that would keep me and mine forever at the bottom of the social scale."
If you want to fight Varnashram itself, then I cannot be in your camp. Because I strongly believe Varnashram to be an integral part of Hinduism.
On caste and cruelty of it, Ambedkar masterpiece, the annihilation of caste remains unsuppressed in its literary distinction and sheer raw energy. It has the power to move mountains but not saints. Ambedkar understood, experienced and witnessed that the Varna system was inherently and irrevocably intertwined with the caste system. He once said, "The names Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra are names which are associated with a definite and fixed notion in the mind of every Hindu. That notion is that of hierarchy based on birth, So long as these names continue, Hindu will continue to think of the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra as hierarchical divisions of high and low based on birth and to act accordingly. To continue the old names is to make the reforms futile. To allow this Chaturvarna based on worth to be designated by such stinking labels as Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, indicative of social divisions based on birth, is a snare. What Ambedkar says next is crucial for understanding the intervening of the Varna in the caste, a point missed by some who support the Varna and not the caste, or others like Gandhi who support both the Varna and the caste, says Ambedkar. Chaturvarna is based on worth. How are you going to compel people who have acquired a higher status based on birth without reference to the worth to beget the status? How are you going to compel people to recognize the status due to a man in accordance with his worth who is occupying a lower status based on his birth? For this, you must first break up the caste system in order to be able to establish the Chaturvarna system. How are you going to reduce the 4,000 castes based on birth to the 4 Varnas based on work? This is the first difficulty that the protagonists of the Chaturvarna must grapple with. The modern science has shown that the lumping together of individuals into few sharply marked off classes is a superficial view of man, not worthy of serious consideration. Consequently, the utilization of the qualities of individuals is incompatible with their stratification by classes, since the qualities of individuals are so variable. Chaturvarna must fail, namely, that it is not possible to pigeonhole men according as they belong to one class or the other. That is impossible to accurately classify people into 4 definite classes is proved by the fact that the original 4 classes have now become 4,000 castes. Gandhi, true to his nature, hung on till his last in claiming both were hereditary cohorts. No amount of brilliant, methodical and detailed reasoning provided by Ambedkar could convince Gandhi to think otherwise. Gandhi's rebuttal to the annihilation of caste was predictable and lacking in intellectual depth. Dr. Ambedkar is a challenge to Hinduism, began Gandhi, and then tried to counter Ambedkar's arguments on the needs for foregoing caste and forgetting Varna. It was saluted and patronizing in tone. Ambedkar rebutted Gandhi's rebuttal. I am not in the habit of entering into controversy with my opponents unless there are special reasons which compel me to act otherwise. Had my opponent been some mean and obscure person, I would not have pursued him. But my opponent being the Mahatma himself, I feel I must attempt to meet the case to the contrary which he has sought to put forth. Yet again Ambedkar was forced to channel all his energies into countering Gandhi, and yet again he had it with precision and aplomb, ending with words that continue to resonate long after I have been read. Ambedkar's dismantling of Mahatma was not linear or chronological in the sense that his rebuttals and critics were not always immediate follow-up responses and Gandhi's arguments. But Ambedkar made sure he never missed an opportunity to critique them in the strongest possible terms, even if years had lapsed since they were uttered. And it is then one realizes what Ambedkar was up to. Who else but Ambedkar to have assessed Gandhi like no one ever dared to before or after him? He was preparing for posterity an enormous counterbalance, resource against someone who he knew only too well, was soon going to make the jump from a Mahatma to a deity, the keeper of the truth and purity of thought. The entire world would fall at the apostle's feet. Any criticism of him would soon be considered blasphemous. Ambedkar was preparing us for that day. He ever wrote a fat book and titled it What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables, with chapter headings that were self-explanatory. Beware of Mr. Gandhi, Gandhiism the doom of the untouchables. Beware of Mr. Gandhi contains 1475 words and each one of them speaks 1,000 pictures. Ambedkar, as was his nature, charts out in piercing detail Gandhi's political timeline beginning 1894, demonstrating beyond doubt that Gandhi was a fraud when it came to the Dalit cause. Ambedkar, in a rare radio interview to the BBC 1 year before his death, explained the duplicitous core of the Mahatma with chilling lucidity. I knew Gandhi better than most people because he opened his real fangs to me and I could see the inside of the man.
I met him first, I say, in 1929 through the intervention of a friend of mine, common friend, who asked Mr. Gandhi to see me. And so Mr. Gandhi wrote to me saying that he would like to see me. So I went and saw him. That was just before going to the round table conference. And then he came to the second round table, didn't come for the first. He was there for about 5-6 months. There, of course, I met him also and faced him also. Then, once thereafter, he also, after the signing of the Pune Pact, asked me to come and see him. So I went to see him. He was then in jail. But that's all the time that I have met him. But I always say that as I met Mr. Gandhi in the capacity of an opponent, I have a feeling that I know him better than most other people because he had opened his real fangs to me and I could see the inside of the man. You see, while others who generally went there as devotees saw nothing of him except the external appearance which he had put up as a Mahatma. But I saw him in his human capacity, the bare man in him. And so I say that I understand him better than most of the people who have associated themselves with him can say.
By 1935, Ambedkar was done with civil obedience, with negotiation with compromise from his perspective. All tactics to claim and gain basic minimum dignity for untouchables had failed. He had a very senior monk pronounce the 3 refutes and 5 undertakings, and Ambedkar and his second wife, his Brahmin doctor, his own doctor, whom he had married in 1948, 13 years after the premature death of his first wife, declaring that he was born a Hindu but would not die as one. At a small conference held in Yola, Nasik, Ambedkar had already quit Hinduism in 1935. Highlighting reasons for the decision, the leader told his followers, "So long as we remain in a religion which teaches a man to treat another man like a leper, the sense of discrimination on account of caste, which is deeply rooted in our minds, cannot go. For annihilating caste and untouchables, change of religion is the only antidote." In 1936, Ambedkar launched the Independent Labour Party, and in 1937 his party contested on 117 seats in the provincial elections held after the Government of India Act 1935, which gave to India partial political autonomy as a joint step towards complete independence from British rule.
When I look back at the past 10 years of our movement, I despair of the future. Enough! We are no longer dumb animals. The time has come to put an end to this harassment and indignities. Let's leave this cesspool of caste which made us worse than worms. Break these shackles. Destroy the social prison. Let's choose a new religion which will guarantee us equality of status and opportunities. Unfortunately, I was born a Hindu untouchable. It was beyond my power to prevent that. But it is within my power to refuse to live under these humiliating conditions. Though I was born a Hindu, I solemnly assure you that I will not die as a Hindu.
Ambedkar was practically the only one in all of modern India's political history to think seriously about solidarity of caste and classes. On the whole, India's left parties from the colonial era into post-colonial times have failed quite miserably in this regard. Throughout this period, Ambedkar wrote, travelled, lectured, published like a fiend. In 1937, he was elected to the Bombay Legislative Assembly, and in 1942, he was elected to the Labour member on the Viceroy's Executive Council. That same year, he also founded the All India Scheduled Caste Federation, which was modelled on the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. In 1946, he was elected as a member of Constituent Assembly, and in April 1947, Article 17 of the draft Constitution abolished untouchability. Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in January 1948. In November of 1949, Ambedkar's 3 historic speeches to the Constituent Assembly, announcing the completion of work on the Constitution and talking about how the new nation might move forward into post-colonial future. In January 26, 1950, India's Constitution was promulgated as a preamble to this document, which has been modified a bit from the original form. Now states, "We the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic and political liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith and work. Equality of status and opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of individual on the unity and integrity of the nation. In our Constituent Assembly, this 26th day of November 1949, do hereby adopt, enact and give to ourselves this Constitution. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, born and despised Mahar in British India about 60 years before this day, was the first law minister in Prime Minister Nehru's cabinet and a leading contributor on the text of the Constitution. The Constitution, which not only abolished untouchability but also included various measures of positive discrimination to safeguard the rights of groups that now been called scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. It's really difficult to overstate the distance covered in the exact duration of this man's life, but Indian society and polity not done it. Ambedkar, who finally was in the right position to do something about Hinduism as a whole and not just the rights of untouchables, now tried to present and push through the newly constituted parliament a piece of legislation called the Hindu Code Bill. Ambedkar's major concern for women's status has been reflected in the Hindu Code Bill. He has even remarked that his work on the Hindu Code Bill would be as important as his work on the Constitution itself. The bill itself was an immense exodus from the Hinduism and its degrading set of laws regarding gender. Through the bill, women were to be granted absolute right regarding all property. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's approach to women's rights is exclusively different from social reformers like Jyotiba Phule, Rajaram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and Mahatma Gandhi, who tried to reform the Hindu society of certain outdated customs and practices without questioning the hierarchical social order, but Ambedkar made his own view for the women's rights, and that has been reflected in Indian Constitution. Dr. Ambedkar portrayed how women were treated maliciously by the way of imposed widowhood, sati and child marriages, just to uphold the draconian social norms in a society. The prophecy of Dr. Ambedkar about women is unequivocally portrayed in Indian Constitution. If the bill passed and enacted into a law, this was intended to reform the Hindu marriage property and inheritance away from caste-based patriarchal customs and conventions, and bring the Hindu community in line with the new framework of democratic citizenship with guarantees of equality and dignity, justice and adult franchise for men and women alike, and for all Indian citizens regardless of caste, religion or gender. He was the one who piloted the Hindu Reform Bill. He was the one as Law Minister reformed the Hindu Personal Code, something that the Government of India or the Muslim scholars today are still unable to do with the Muslim Code. And he dared to tell the Hindus they could not have 4 wives anymore. He dared to tell them that their traditional customary practices could not work in a civilized country. Core of the Hindu Code Bill, which upset the caste Hindus and particularly Brahmins, was it give the right to property to women and right to divorce.
Favor of the passage of the controversial Hindu Code Bill that was put forward by Dr. Ambedkar, whose aim it is to improve the woman's lot. He believes the barometer of an enlightened society can be discerned by the status of its women.
Murdabad! Murdabad! Hatado! Hatado! Hatado!
The Hindu Code Bill is an insult to Hindu Dharma Shastra. It casts aspersions on our hoary traditions and Shastras. What does Dr. Ambedkar know of Hindu Dharma Shastra? Does he know Sanskrit? Has he read Vedas? In a revenge, he's out to destroy the Hindu Dharma Shastra by one blow of this law. Are we going to allow an untouchable to touch our sacred God-given laws?
Never, never. We shall shed blood, an uncouth, unclean, untouchable, defiling the laws set centuries ago by Bhagwan Shri Krishna, Bhagwan Manu, Bhagavad Gita, Vedas and Upanishads.
Baba Sahib, from the Prime Minister's office.
Read it.
You know that we have a good deal of opposition to the Hindu Code Bill both inside and outside the house. With the best will in the world, it cannot be passed in this session. I can quite understand your disappointment. Even the marriage and divorce parts of the bill had ultimately to be postponed.
Atrocious. Ratu, come and take dictation. For a long time, I have been thinking of resigning my seat from the cabinet. The only thing that held me was the hope that it would be possible to give effect to the Hindu Code Bill. But with its demise, even the marriage and divorce part of it is killed. I see no purpose in me continuing as a member.
The bill failed outrageously, unbelievably, almost contradicting history itself. Ambedkar faced the very same wall that he stood in front of in Baroda in 1917, when he was thrown out of his quarters despite being the Maharaja's military secretary. In Maharad in 1927, where the Chowdhury tank was purified by caste Hindus after untouchables had drunk water from it. In Pune in 1932, when Gandhi threatened to die rather than giving up on the caste system. In Yola again in 1935, where Baba Saheb knew that he had reached the limits of his tolerance. Once again, Ambedkar resigned his position, this time as Law Minister.
The Hindu Code Bill was the greatest social reform measure ever undertaken by the legislature in this country. To leave inequality between class and class, sex and sex, as in Hindu society, untouched. And to go on passing legislation on economic reforms is to make a farce of our constitution and to build a palace on a dung heap.
He quit Nehru's government and he set out to finally try to figure out what it was, if not politics, if not polemics, not legislation, if not legal and judicial reform that would jolt Indian society out of its age-old habits of caste hierarchy, differentiation and discrimination, and make good the promise that he had first announced at Yola in 1935. On October 14 and 15 in 1956 in a place called Nagpur, which is ironically otherwise the headquarters of the RSS, Dr. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism was not impulsive. It was as much an endorsement of a new way of life for the country's Dalit community, as it was a total rejection of Hinduism and the oppression it came to characterize for people of the so-called lower castes. Ambedkar in his wisdom somehow understood that caste was not going away. So after exhausting all the options, he turned at last in 1950s to the idea of religious conversion for Dalits and specifically conversion to Buddhism as a religion that they ought to consider. The parent organization of India's Hindu Right, Ambedkar conducted a spectacular public ritual of a kinnor has never been seen in the entire recorded history of Buddhism. These two individuals repeated after the monk and became Buddhists. Almost 500,000 Dalits who were present on those 2 days followed Ambedkar down the new way, the Navayana, significantly and again in a radical departure from tradition. Ambedkar himself devised 22 additional vows, most of it spelled out how converts will reject and assure Hindu and especially caste-based practices as a part of their new faith, or their very old faith now recovered from new oblivion of history.
My beloved brothers and sisters, I have renounced the Hindu religion and I am embracing the great Buddha and his Dhamma based on equality of man, knowledge, right path and compassion. Hear me, my brothers and sisters. I am no longer a Hindu, no longer an untouchable. I am a liberated human being, a free man, no longer a slave of a pernicious social system.
Ambedkar's life has two phases. The initial phase climaxes at Yola speech in October 1935. The final phase climaxes at another speech made in Nagpur in central India in October 1956. Ambedkar has sick with diabetes, heart disease and nervous exhaustion by 1956. The last year of his life, nevertheless, he stayed up nights and he rose up to complete his manuscript, which was only published posthumously in 1957. His followers did call it not a death, but Mahaparinirvana, the great ultimate enlightenment, a modern day enlightenment, a modern day liberation. On the latter occasion, Ambedkar converted to Buddhism, redeeming his promise not to die as Hindu. He did in fact and finished his book, and 6 weeks later on, he died on December 6, 1956 at his house in Delhi. Ambedkar wanted something much more fundamental, much overweening than the ancient prophets or orthostats. He wanted rather far himself and any Dalit to be recognized as fully, simply, and as only human, not Superman, but just a man, not barely, not brutish, not subhuman, not some creature, perpetually cast out of society into the hell that is an inequality but human. How is this possible? What was the point of human progress in science and culture if in the end it all boiled of discovering the neutron when in a village thousands of miles and a few dreams away from the Cavendish Village Laboratory, a little boy of 9 had to drive a bullock cart by himself and go thirsty the whole night because he was not allowed to drink water? The answer was given by none other than Ambedkar. His standing up, his fighting for his rights, his drafting the constitution, his saving India from barbarism, his keeping India alive was the answer, his life was answer. Ambedkar is for human freedom. Ambedkar belonged to the greatest tradition of social reformers and freedom fighters in the real sense, was trying to bring freedom to the people. So long as the Indian Constitution survives, the name of Dr. Ambedkar will remain immortal. He lives forever in the hearts of every downtrodden,